Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And Laura in the studio.
And we've just watched 90 minutes of 7 top-flight, frontline politicians and our colleague Mishal Husain.
We have.
Do you know what I've learnt, though?
What?
Don't wolf down a giant chicken souvlaki before then intensely watching 90 minutes of television.
Why not?
I don't know if it's like just listening really hard can give you indigestion. I think it can. That's what
Listening specifically to 7 politicians or just listening to something very hard?
Yeah, if it was an episode of Friends, would have... Anyway, right, so we've just seen the debate. Actually, before we dive into it, we should just explain what the actual format was.
We should.
So this was known as the 7-way.
Yes. So this was a big, important debate in the general election. It was the first one of its kind when not just the Tories and the Labour Party were represented. So the Labour Party and the Conservatives sent along 2 of their prominent politicians, but not the leaders. The other parties then had either their Westminster leader, like Stephen Flynn for the Scottish National Party, or their deputy leader, Daisy Cooper, prominent. But then we had the leader of Plaid Cymru. We had Nigel Farage, who, of course, recently has now miraculously become the leader of Reform after a very short and intensely democratic process. Not. And then also we had Carla Denyer, who's the co-leader of the Greens, and she's standing for a seat in Bristol. And have I got to 7 already, or am I misremembering?
No, that was 7.
Have I got to 7?
I think that was
Right,
7.
that's
It might be
7, yeah.
Souvlaki talking, but
So it's a big debate with all of the parties who are fielding candidates in the election being represented. And as a result of that, what you have is, of course, the sort of battle royal going on between Labour and the Tories, but you have an opportunity to hear from a much broader rainbow of political opinion.
Yeah, it means on the one hand it's less focused than when it was Starmer versus Sunak on Tuesday and it's just 2 people going head to head on a range of issues. It becomes a bit more sprawling, but equally it feels more like Britain because you're hearing about Wales and you're hearing about Scotland.
Sure, and it's a reflection also of the fact that there are lots of different kinds of political races in lots of different kinds of constituencies. There are races that are between the SNP and the Tories. In some parts of more rural Scotland, they tend to be. There are, of course, that are places that are races between the Lib Dems and Tories in lots of parts of the southwest and the affluent commuter belt around London. So that it gives us that reminder that these important conversations are going on, that in a first past the post country, like it or not, of course, the most intense competition is between Labour and the Tories, and there's good reason for that. But there is a myriad of other types of contests out there too.
And because Labour and the Conservatives are the 2 parties there who are trying to appeal to the biggest group of people, their message perhaps seems the least distinctive because the other parties are speaking to particular groups of voters in parts of the country. So they can be a little bit more precise. And also they've got an incentive to criticise the two big parties saying, oh, you're both kind of the same.
Yeah, and they all do, right? And what was one of the interesting things, and I'm sure we'll get into this, one of the interesting things tonight is that all of the smaller parties are basically behaving as if a Labour victory is inevitable. And particularly for the SNP, that they are almost marketing themselves as vote for us because we'll keep Labour honest. The Green Party is also doing that. Now, of course, the election result is not decided. Voters are volatile. The polls are very heavily pointing one way, but it's interesting to see the smaller parties all sort of say, hey, we're the brake on those guys, and the Greens and the SNP are sort of marketing themselves almost like being Labour's conscience, if you like.
And the massive, immense news story that's been happening in the general election campaign outside this building is Rishi Sunak's decision, turns out to be pretty bad decision for him, to come back from D-Day early to do a TV interview. And he's been criticised by pretty much everyone, although he did do a big apology, which is kind of a rare thing at this point in an election campaign.
You could not make this up. So the Tory election campaign so far has been trying to appeal to a particular group of voters, to try to appeal to their sense of patriotism. They got out of the gates at the beginning of the election campaign with their catchiest policy, which was promising compulsory national service or voluntary service for 18-year-olds. And yet Rishi Sunak, who had the opportunity of a couple of days of beautiful, choreographed, looking like a statesman on the world stage, managed somehow to leave that early, to miss these photo opportunities in order to come back to London and to get on with other business, which included a TV interview. You could not make up how bad a political story this has been, how bad a political mistake it has been for Rishi Sunak. And I mean, we could do a whole episode on that, but I think we have to get on with the debate. But not surprisingly, it's such a big story that at the beginning of the debate, it wasn't very long before this came up.
Yeah, and so the first question, because the questions all came from the audience, was a bigger, broader question about defence. But of course, everyone took that as their opportunity to have a go at Rishi Sunak, including, as you will hear, even the person who's representing the Conservatives, Penny Mordaunt. But the first person to have a bite at the cherry on that was Reform UK leader Nigel Farage.
The veterans' point's been made already. Respect our veterans, including those with the average age of 100 who were deserted by the Prime Minister in Normandy yesterday, which I think was a complete and utter disgrace and shows us we actually have a very unpatriotic Prime Minister. It was dreadful.
And then we heard from Penny Mordaunt. So she's leader of the House of Commons. That's her kind of cabinet day job. And she was representing the Tories today on the stage. And this is what she said.
What happened was completely wrong. And the Prime Minister has rightly apologised for that, apologised to veterans, but also to all of us, because he was representing all of us. I'm from Portsmouth. I've also been Defence Secretary, and my wish at the end of this week is that all of our veterans feel completely treasured.
Now, just before we go on to hear what the others have to say, I just want to spell out in giant, big letters.
That's what I was going to ask you to do.
Okay, great minds. Or minds that agree. For a serving cabinet minister to be standing on the most public of stages saying that the Prime Minister, who's her boss, who's trying to win an election, is completely wrong, is completely incredible. Right?
Yeah, because there was a softer way she could have done that.
Of course, there are all sorts of ways she should have. She could have done what David Cameron did, was say it's a tribute to his honesty that he's acknowledged it was a bit of a mishap or a bad judgment or something like that.
Or she could have listed 12 things the government's done to help veterans.
Correct. Or she could have said, look, he's apologised and what I'd like to do is emphasise the record. And she didn't just say it once. I think she said it 3 and maybe 4 times. This is extraordinary for the Tories to have got themselves into this situation where somebody prominent is being put forward by the party and has used that platform to criticise the Prime Minister so plainly. He apologised himself, which again, in the context of an election campaign, is something extremely unusual. I think he didn't have a choice because it was such an incredible misstep. I mean, somebody in the Tory ranks said to me today, it is evidence that this is, and I quote, the worst political operation of modern times. I'm sure Rishi Sunak's team would have a few words to say about that. But today, aside from this debate, today for the Tories has been absolutely appalling. And of course, that coloured the tone of the whole debate. And they did get on to other subjects, but I think that most of the sort of news bulletins and most of the papers and most of the news websites and stuff in the morning will still be leading on this D-Day snafu. And Penny Mordaunt's comments, she's no big fan of Rishi Sunak, really. She's not...
Well, she tried to get the job ahead of him.
She tried to get the job ahead of him. She still is understood to have leadership aspirations. And this, in and of itself, is something that is absolutely extraordinary that it happened.
And I think the Telegraph front page describes it as withering. And so when the Telegraph, who are meant to be the Tories' best friends in the media, say withering about a Conservative talking about the Prime Minister, you know it's withering. Then it was the turn of Daisy Cooper. As Laura was saying, she's deputy leader of the Liberal Democrats, and she was talking about her grandfather who served in the Second World War, and she quoted from his diary.
He recounted in his words, men blown to pieces, hands, legs and heads. Okay. If he had been there yesterday and seen the Prime Minister walk away from him, I would have found that completely, as I do now, find it completely and utterly unforgivable.
Now, that was interesting because the thing about the Lib Dems in this campaign is that in the olden days, the Lib Dems would try to appeal to Labour voters and Tory voters equally. But this time round, the Liberal Democrats are focused very much on the south of the country and trying to steal seats from the Tories. Now, I'm not suggesting that at any point in their history, the Lib Dems would have been unpatriotic and would have criticised D-Day veterans. That was never going to happen. I thought it was interesting that Daisy Cooper just sort of was really embracing the armed forces there, because there would be a wing of the Liberal Democrats in the past that would have found that a little bit uncomfortable. Not because they were unpatriotic, but just because they wouldn't want to be quite so kind of flag waving for the military, maybe.
Well, it's not always been a kind of easy fit Except that I think what you talk to as actually is a place that the Lib Dems used to be into, where they used to kind of face both ways, right? I mean, don't forget Paddy Ashton, who was one of their most popular leaders ever. He was a military man, right? He was, I think, a Marine or something, you know. And so I think they've often tried to face both ways. You're absolutely right that this time, you know, they are, given where the opinion polls are, it's not surprising. They think that their opportunities are to take seats from the Tories, and they're not really trying to fight in all sorts of different areas in the way that they have done in the past. But I think actually what we heard there yesterday reminds us why this story is such a problem for the Tories, because there will be thousands of families around the country who feel what happened very personally, who feel that this was completely unacceptable, who saw the pictures of those incredible old men and women yesterday and have the memories of their own family and people who gave their own lives, or gave their own sacrifices, and think, what, you walked away from that? Now, maybe there were logistical important reasons for Rishi Sunak to make the decision in the way that he did, and who knows why the original decision was taken. But
and we know this was a decision taken before there was even an election for him to come back to do an interview for.
Correct. But it's been interesting today, and there's sort of whispers around it. You know, somebody said to me, look, if the civil service warned him not to do it. Somebody else said to me it was definitely his decision rather than other people's decision taken some time ago. We don't exactly know what the motivation was. But I think Daisy Cooper, as you say, you know, the Lib Dems, you wouldn't normally expect them to be sort of, you know, rah, rah, hooray, we're all about the military. But you could tell from her, she was sort of capturing, I think, a genuine sort of sense of disbelief that, you know, probably lots of newscasters listening tonight might have felt.
Let's continue with our chewing over of the debate. Another little indigestion reference there.
Are you really having problems?
Have you got any?
Do I need to go and get you some Rennies?
No, it's fine. It's fine. I might have one afterwards. So the kind of other big subplot of this, though, was the two women who were stood at. Oh, I always get this the wrong way around. Were they staged right? Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt.
Yes.
Yeah. So as you look at it, they were on the right.
Yes.
Yeah. And actually, there was several moments in the debate where actually it did feel like Sunak versus Starmer. It did feel like there was only two people on that stage. And one of those moments was this epic ding-dong they had about tax. And here is just a small slither of it.
Why don't you stand by your record? Record levels of taxes on working people. 26 separate tax hikes in the last Parliament.
About 12 new taxes that Labour are going to bring in.
Absolute rubbish. We've absolutely guaranteed we will not raise taxes for working people in this country.
How are you going to close that gap? £2,000.
And there was a real burn from Carla Denyer a bit later when she said, oh, well, that was dignified, wasn't it? But I think actually for some people watching, they'll have felt that the Penny v Ange moments were actually when it kind of came alive.
Yes.
And they are both good communicators, right? They're both good communicators. They're both incredibly polished.
Oh, and they both have a look. And I don't mean that in a superficial way, but
they both have strong personalities, and you know they both know how to try and go for an audience. And I think there might have been some people watching tonight who thought, well, actually, the two women going at it was a bit more interesting than the two men going at it on Tuesday night. And maybe that's a glimpse of a future contest. Perhaps. And it was one of the sort of digs, actually, that Penny Mordaunt was trying to make at Angela Rayner, was saying, oh, she might be Prime Minister one day, which some people might have thought, oh, my God, and some people might have thought, oh, hooray. We know that Angela Rayner and Penny Mordaunt are both that unusual thing. They are both people who are not political party leaders, but they cut through. People have heard of them. Focus groups, people raise them unprompted. People have heard of Angela Rayner. People have heard of Penny Mordaunt, which, explains why the parties put them up tonight. But in their clashes, there was real kind of energy and real fire. Penny Mordaunt, getting quite shouty, repeating the Tories' slightly dodgy £2,000 tax line on Labour.
Yeah, that's not gone away, has it?
That's not.
Despite all the slaps on the wrist they've had.
But of course it's not going to go away. The point, we talked about this the other day, when political parties do these things, they do it because they want to create the conversation. They don't go, oh, well, we've had a slap on the wrist, we better not say it again. It doesn't work like that. And, I'm not surprised that she raised it again tonight. Quite right that Mishal Husain, who played a blinder, I think calmly controlling 7 of them is quite something, pointed out quite rightly that official bodies and the top Treasury civil servant have said you're using that gear inappropriately. You're not being clear about it. But of course the Tories are going to keep on using it. Of course they are.
Just to update you, a source close to this podcast who has knowledge of production says actually they were stage left because it's how they are. It's where they are on this facing
Okay, camera
outlets.
right.
Yeah, exactly.
We're broadcasting.
We're not theatre
Danny,
people. We're television people.
Broadcasters. Broadcasters.
Just
telly people.
Two
terrible television people.
Talking about appearances, though, two very superficial questions for me about Penny Mordaunt.
Yeah, go on.
I'm not an expert in this. Her hair.
Yeah.
How do you get hair that voluminous?
Just an amazing blow dry.
Is that just a blow?
It's a really big blow dry and a lot of products.
Okay.
But it's flippant to talk about women's hair, Adam.
No, but
unless
it's not,
you're then
because
going to talk about other people's look.
No, because it's part of no, but it's part of Penny Mordaunt's shtick.
Of course it is.
Like, and it's a bit Thatcherite. It's like it's.
Well, she's just got big, fabulous hair in the way that also Angela Rayner has incredible hair, and they're both they're very conscious, as a lot of politicians are. I think that they are both conscious of their kind of look.
Well, yeah, just
and
like
good politicians do think about how they look and how they come across, and that might make it shallow, but
No, but Nigel Farage's version of a blow dry is a pint. Like I saw him drinking one at 11:58 the other day. It's really early.
Exactly, and optics matter in politics. So newscasters, I hope nobody's offended for us talking about people's looks, but it is, of course, it's important. In the Keir Starmer, I'm going to take my jacket off and do this speech without a jacket and a tie, or Rishi Sunak, I'm going to do this clip in my little cashmere woolen half zip number over a work shirt, which I've never. Can you explain that look to me?
I don't go for that look
because quite a lot of blokes do go for that, and I don't get it. But
I digress now. But I went into
you.
I was in the city of London for lunch the other day. There, not with like a city time. It just happened to be where lunch was, and the number of people wearing gilets. I thought it was a myth that all the city boys wear like a white shirt and a gilet. We're all wearing black gilets. What was I going to say about appearance? Oh, body language.
Yes.
Keir Starmer at the PM debate on Tuesday, I thought the bit where he seemed most like where he most seemed like the Keir Starmer you see when you in the old days when you could bump into him coming out of Pret was the bit where he. Do you know? Remember, like before he was
the leader,
and you'd have a little like a person to person chat thing rather than like I put it to you, was the bit where he leaned over the lectern to talk about football. And he just seemed he seemed like your mate's mate who just knows loads of football. Anyway,
but he does that lean on he does that a bit, and he does that lean, and then soon also, they all have their sort of tics and things, and I really like watching for that because they also all have them during interviews,
right?
And I'm not going to divulge those because I don't want to say any of those. Yeah, the tells, because they're really handy.
When you're sat in Casino Royale. The other superficial thing about Penny Mordaunt, did you notice how American she was?
Well, yeah, she sounded...
Cutting your
some
Texas.
bits she sounded like she... I mean, it just these are big events for politicians, and they all practice for them, and it's perfectly possible that some of them will also have had some kind of speech training. I don't necessarily mean specifically for tonight, but it's hard, right? It's hard.
Let's go back to policy.
Yeah,
I mean, I talk about it as if you were the one talking about superficial stuff, and I had to bring us back. And I had to bring us back to the straight and narrow.
No, you raised the blow dry.
Anyway, right, immigration.
Yeah.
So one of the things about when you've got the more progressive parties, the more left-wing parties like the Greens, the SNP and Plaid Cymru, and they would unashamedly say they are, it means that when it comes to immigration, rather than the talk being about numbers being too high or which lever can we pull to get more control or which category of visa do you crack down on, you actually get some quite passionate defences of why the country might need immigrants. And we got that from Run Ap Yorworth for Plaid, Carla Denyer for the Greens and Stephen Flynn from the SNP.
We need to stop the vile and expensive Rwanda flights. We need safe passage into this country, and we need to realise that we need immigration for the interests of our health system, our care system and our economy.
Whether they're coming here fleeing violence and persecution as asylum seekers, or whether they're coming here to work in many of our understaffed sectors like health and social care. If you meet a migrant in the NHS, they're more likely to be treating you, as I was the last time I saw a GP, than being ahead of you in the queue.
There's also a conspiracy of silence on other issue, and that's Brexit. Because Brexit has impacted the economy more than the COVID pandemic. It has put your food bills up completely unnecessarily. It has been an unmitigated disaster for the economy.
It's really interesting to hear them all together like that, because we were talking about at the beginning, obviously the UK national debate is dominated by Labour and the Tories, and they are both right now in this era in a position of saying migration's too high, here are our various ways in which we want to get it down, although neither of them would give numbers on that at the moment. There was, of course, though, Nigel Farage on the end saying that the two main parties have completely fudged this, that migration is far too high, that things have got kind of completely out of control as he would have it. But it was really interesting to hear that dynamic from the smaller progressive parties, as they would call themselves, even in response to a question from the audience, from a young guy called Lorenzo, who said in his part of the world in Essex, actually, he kind of said the roads are too congested, there are real problems with everything. And his belief is that immigration is part of the problem, just in sheer scale of numbers. So it was a really interesting moment in the debate. Also a reminder that in different parts of the country, there are different requirements in terms of the population. You know, so if you spend a lot of time in the conurbation of the southeast, you might feel a certain way about the population of the country. If you spend different time in, you know, in the north of Scotland or in rural Wales, or, you know, you might feel very differently. I think, though, also there's always a risk in characterising public sentiment in those other parts of the country as being completely represented by those parties that come from one side of the spectrum or another, you know, in the same way that you wouldn't say that the Conservatives represent everybody in the south of England. That's clearly not true. You wouldn't also say that Plaid represents everybody's point of view in Wales, or the SNP represents everybody's point of view on immigration in Scotland. So, but it was an interesting moment nonetheless, and just a different texture, right? Instead of two parties competing on quite narrow turf, actually a much broader spectrum.
And talking about broader spectrum, it's interesting to see Nigel Farage talking about lots of different things. Now, if you've watched Nigel Farage in detail like we have over the years, you've heard him talk about tax and you've heard him say the NHS is a terrible system and actually France does it much better with insurance. You've heard him talking about the public finances. But usually his big applause lines and his things that he gets lots of attention for are Brexit and immigration. Actually, when you get Nigel Farage sort of slightly diluted a bit because he's having to talk about lots of things, I wonder if maybe he just seems less, I don't quite know what the word I'm searching for is.
Well, I think Farage didn't really
Less...
sort of fire tonight, right? So there have been lots of occasions where actually he can sort of grab the conch in a big debate or on Question Time or something. Right?
We need more conches.
We need more conch. We should have a conch on Newscast, for goodness sake.
Sky, if you're listening, you've got your debate next week.
I might bring one, actually. Yeah, exactly. We should
could
have
introduce
that on
it on Radio 4 tomorrow morning, live at 10:30.
Very Radio 4 reference there. Yes, we have a conch, so we could debate the conch and the literary history of the conch. But anyway,
I'm just googling it.
It was
Farage.
interesting.
Yeah.
It was interesting. He can be, and has been on lots of occasions, very good at grabbing the conch, grabbing and then hogging the limelight in the makeup where tonight's debate and where there are other very strong debaters. He didn't dominate. But I was interesting. I think one of the things where he really stood out, though, was what he said about shoplifting. And I wonder if there'll be a lot of pickup on that. So he basically said in the answer to the question about knife crime, that basically anyone can go shoplifting now, and unless you nick more than 200 quid, you don't get nicked, you don't get lifted. And you could he sort of went into Nigel Farage, full-on Farage mode. But he was trying to sort of appeal to the audience, and you didn't get the sense that in that room, which of course was selected by pollsters very carefully and all the rest, you didn't get the sense in that room that he was really, racking up the support. But then people watching at home as well might have had a very different view, but he didn't seem to be on his it wasn't Farage in full flight, I didn't think tonight.
And we should say there's a lot more of these big set piece opportunities coming up. So I mentioned the Sky debate, which will be a one-on-one between the potential PMs.
Yep.
That's next Wednesday.
Yep.
Then from Monday, Nick Robinson's Panorama in-depth half-hour interviews get started with everyone. Although I noticed Keir Starmer hasn't signed up to do one yet.
Yes, and
or maybe they're still
we should
negotiating.
also theoretically be having them on the Sunday. So there is a lot of content to come, and also what happens through a campaign also is that the politicians tend to get better at it. But also there's a big risk that their lines sort of become more hackneyed. But don't remember, our newscasters are all, assiduous consumers of current affairs. And if you're new, then welcome along. You will soon become an assiduous consumer of current affairs. But there's tons and tons and tons of people for whom the election, quite understandably, is still sort of background noise. we've still got 4 weeks to go, folks. And things could change, and lots of people still will only be hearing really the very, very broad soundtrack of this, and won't necessarily have tuned into it very much.
I'm just thinking of other milestones that have happened today. Labour's Clause 5 meeting.
Yes.
Really jargony, but it's an important bit because the Labour Party they're very processy compared to other parties. And one of the big parts of the process is this meeting, which is called Clause 5, because of the bit of the Labour Party constitution that says you got to do this, which is where all the big wigs from the unions, different interest groups within Labour come together to basically sign off the manifesto, which they did today.
They did, apart from Unite the Union, which gave them £3 million last time round, but they are unhappy about some of the particular commitments or lack of commitments that they see when it comes to fire and rehire, which is one of the things meant to get rid of the practice that companies like BA did, where they sacked a load of staff and then took them back on less good terms and conditions. And Unite believes that the Labour plan for that isn't watertight, and they're unhappy about the policy about oil and gas. But yeah, broadly speaking, Labour got it signed off today. They're sort of happy. And I will see the manifestos, Tories on Tuesday, Labour, I think, on Thursday. But I think it's really interesting because the Tories now, you would imagine, and it's been suggested to me, although I don't, have it 100%, and who knows when we'll see it in black and white, but you have that sense where they are still trying to rack up policy. They're still trying to go, let's do this and let's do this, let's do this. I think tomorrow they're going to announce that they are going to scrap stamp duty for up to over £400,000.
Yes,
Yeah.
I think.
But Labour, it's very tightly controlled. I think it's going to be quite a skinny document. It's going to say we're going to reform public services. It's not about having a bigger pie to spend loads more money. Somebody in Labour said to me today, it's not going to be about cutting up the pie like a traditional Labour manifesto, because the Tories have eaten the pie and burned down the kitchen or something like that. So we're going to have all these kinds of...
And we've all got indigestion.
And you've still got indigestion. So the manifestos are another big milestone. That is going to be next week. Yeah.
And another milestone for us, which I've already alluded to, is Newscast going live on Radio 4 on Saturday morning at 10:30. So tune in for our inaugural appearance on the wireless.
Well, we could have been on the wireless a few times.
No, but in this format.
Oh, I see. Right. Okay. Yes.
Well, you used to do the radio as well. Anyway, and then it'll be at 11 a.m. on Saturday mornings for the rest of the campaign. My favourite thing about the debate tonight was sitting in this studio, which kind of looks like a living room, watching TV for an hour and a half with you.
Yes.
You were on your laptop taking notes. And I'm now going to picture you like every time you sit and watch a film, you've got your laptop out and you're like, oh, great line from Meryl Streep there. Just writing that down. Is that how you watch films?
Always.
Okay.
Always. I mean, don't you? Isn't that normal behaviour? Or like sort of Barry Norman of 2024. Yes, amazing entrance, camera right.
Camera right.
Love the way that
stage
Tom Hollander...
Meryl came in from stage left. Right, you can tell it's getting very late. We've watched far too much television. Laura, good to catch up with you. Lots of other election coverage coming your way, not just Newscast
amounts.
on Radio 4, but Newscast every day. And you can watch us on BBC iPlayer at various points as well. So, bye.
Goodbye.
Newscast from the BBC.